Hello YouTube, Dave here again. Welcome to the first installment of my series of videos taking a look at the Age of Worms adventure path. So this is the second adventure path to be released in Dungeon Magazine. Previously I did a series covering the Dungeon Magazine editions of the Shackled City adventure path. There is still the hardcover book to go back and revisit as well, so that's something that I will be doing at some point in the future. But I kind of wanted to cover this one next. I was really sort of interested in going back and rereading or flipping through some of these again. And for some reason, I don't know exactly what it was, but I just started getting a little bit nostalgic for, my times running 3.5, even though I'm not interested in running 3.5 ever again. For some odd reason, I just sort of, got, like I said, a little nostalgic for it. So I picked these up off my shelf, started looking through them, and feel that this is just a good as time as any to start going through and doing my review. Like I said, this is the second adventure path from Dungeon Magazine, which at the time was being published by Paizo, who would go on to do like the Pathfinder. In fact, these adventure paths is what really led to them continuing to release like their own adventure paths using the Pathfinder brand, which eventually became its own role-playing game, and we certainly know where that led. This particular installment, this is chapter 1 of the Age of Worms. This took place, or this released in July of 2005 and is Dungeon Magazine issue number 124. The cover, of course, depicts, an apocalyptic scene involving these giant green worms, and it says, introducing the Age of Worms adventure path. I always loved the covers for like the Age of Worms related adventure paths installments. So there's only one issue, I think, of the entire run that doesn't have the adventure path be the subject of the cover. I could be wrong on that, but I'm pretty sure that's the way that it goes. Unlike the last, the Shackled City adventure path, in which the last few installments, like the finale installments, the covers had nothing to do with the actual campaign. So that's definitely not going to be the case with this one. So let's just go ahead and get right into it, shall we? So, chapter 1 of 12 for the Age of Worms adventure path. This is the Whispering Cairn. Now, there is significance to the backstory for this campaign, but I'm not really going to dive into it too deeply in this video. I mainly want to sort of tell the story from the perspective of the player characters. So they'll sort of learn more about the importance of this location as the campaign goes on. But for now, we're just going to focus on just the overall summary of the events, and I'll sort of talk about my experiences running it and my thoughts of this opening chapter compared to the one from the Shackled City adventure path. So this is an adventure for characters levels 1 through 3, so by the time they finish the scenario, they should reach 3rd level. The campaign begins in the town. I guess you could say it's not a city, but it's sort of a corrupt and sort of dismal town of Diamond Lake. It's this mining community which has a series of like burial shrines or tombs, referred to here as cairns, in the hills sort of nearby. The campaign begins when a group of adventurers come to town looking to explore one of the cairns. They are sent to one that the townsfolk, or especially the youth of the town, know very well. It's one that they typically explore a lot, and there's not really anything unique or special about it. However, there is another cairn that is much more interesting that the player characters actually go off to explore. The characters start off as locals from Diamond Lake, so they know fully well the history of the what's referred to as the Whispering Cairn. It's this location where there's a series of, although the characters don't know this, but there's a series of tubes that go from inside of the structure itself to the outside, that as the wind howls over them, or as the wind passes over them, it causes like the sort of whispering or howling sounds to come from the tomb itself. The locals, usually like the children, will dare one another to spend a night inside the Whispering Cairn, which very few do, and even a few years ago, It's reported that a child went missing there, so it definitely has a bit of a history. With these 3 adventurers coming to explore the cairns in the hills outside of Diamond Lake, the player characters become sort of, I guess, emboldened, embiggened, to take a term from The Simpsons, to actually begin their own careers as adventurers and explorers. And they begin their campaign, or they begin the adventure right outside the cairn itself. So we basically cut right to the point where they are there in a place called Coward's Rest, which is where like the children will typically go to rest or try to sleep overnight and usually fail to do so. The cairn itself has been somewhat explored over the years. However, there were some collapsed sections, as well as some puzzles that previous explorers failed to sort of overcome. There's a lantern puzzle that involves different colored lanterns, each the different color of the rainbow, that need to be lit in order to reveal different locations within the dungeon that the characters can start exploring. As it turns out, there's a lot more to this than the simple burial tomb that the characters initially came into. For example, with the rainbow lanterns, whenever they light one, this false sarcophagus is on this platform that's actually shaped like an arrow, and it will rotate to an alcove, which will reveal some sort of passage, be it a real one or a trap that they may fall into that they can go to explore various other locations, including the lair of the architect, which was designed by the person who actually created the tomb itself. The tomb is actually the resting place of a minor lord of or a minor member of the Wind Dukes of Agua, I think it's called. They're the ones who created the Rod of Law, which became the Rod of 7 Parts. So in this battle with the forces of chaos, many of the members of the Wind Dukes were actually buried where they fell, and this is one of the locations, which is something that the player characters sort of come to learn as they explore. There's also the layer of the laborers, so the people that were building the tomb actually had their own sort of common area, their own sort of place to be laid to rest as well. And as we're exploring the tomb, going through it, the players actually come across a bit of a roadblock when they finally reach the true tomb. There's this hallway, or this long chamber with a walkway suspended above a pit that's just filled with these iron spheres. If they set off a particular trap in this room, or there was a trap in this room, that would actually send the spheres like tumbling and flying towards them. But that's something that the players can, hopefully overcome. There's also a Grick hidden within the spheres as well that the characters may have to contend with. However, when they reach the end of this sort of walkway, it actually ends in a door that is locked. And as they, explore it, there's no way for them to open it from the side that they're currently on. That's when the characters are approached, or were a ghost of a young boy who explored the cairn, 30 years ago, and somehow luckily made it past most of the traps, only to die in this hail of spheres room. He says that he can actually open the tomb from the other side if the characters agree to take his bones back to be buried alongside that of his family. So be taken back to his ancestral home and for his bones to be buried. If the characters do that, then he will unlock the door for them so that they can finally explore the true burial tomb of this Wind Duke that has been laid to rest here. When the characters reach the boy's, where the farmstead was, where he grew up and where his family was buried, they discover a couple of things. Number one, the family grave sites have been dug up and the bodies are missing, but they also find a severed arm that is heavily tattooed. The characters, being members of being locals to Diamond Lake, pretty much can easily identify the tattoos as belonging to sort of a thug or bodyguard type of individual for the mine owner in Diamond Lake, this sort of disreputable man by the name of Balavar Smink. Which is just an awesome name, by the way. I love that name so much. The characters go to confront these thugs or bodyguards, or sort of like muscle for this corrupt mining operator. And they have several different ways that they can actually deal with the situation. They can attempt to negotiate sort of peacefully. They can sort of try to appeal to them by giving them, like, they could flatter them, or they could get into a fight. Three guesses as to which one of those potential options that the group that I was running this for took. Anyway, they deal with the situation, they are told that the bones had been dug up and taken to the old observatory just outside of town, where a sort of strange necromancer requested them so that he can, use them as servants. When the characters go to the observatory, they go through, they face off against some of the undead guardians, including some of the skeletons of the family members that need to be returned to their places of burial, along with the bones of the boy who became the ghost inside of the Whispering Cairn tomb, in order to put him into rest and for the characters to be able to explore what's beyond. The Necromancer himself is one of my favorite villains that I think I've ever seen in any of these adventure paths, especially like for someone who is sort of just a throwaway one-time villain. He's just so cool. So this is Filge, the deranged necromancer. Deranged literally in his title. And what was so cool about him, what I like so much about him, is that he uses these like syringes as his attacks. He'll have several different like potions or spells that are sort of condensed down into this like liquid form that he can inject into the player characters. Things like he has like not harm, but like inflict wounds that he has for like some of the ones that he has. He also has syringes that he'll just inject himself with to heal himself or to give himself other sort of protections. He's just such an interesting character overall. Now, he isn't necessarily there to antagonize the player characters. He's just simply someone who's been brought into the town by Mr. Smank to investigate or to study some a relic that he brought back as Balabar was dealing with some less than savory individuals from the cult of the Ebon Triad that has sort of taken up residence within the mines. And so Filge actually has this jar with this formaldehyde solution in it, and inside is this green worm, a single solitary green worm. If the characters are able to interrogate Filge, like, he will try to surrender. If he's reduced to, too few hit points, he will actually, stop and try to just, beg for mercy, because he technically didn't necessarily do anything wrong. He had Balabar Smank's permission to acquire undead servants. He didn't harm any of the townsfolk or anything like that. And he's pretty much willing to give information, including mentioning that Balabar is sort of being strong-armed by the cult of the Ebon Triad. And we'll talk a little bit more about them in future installments. In fact, I think the very next one actually deals with them pretty heavily. But they are sort of a returning force from the previous adventure path as well, which is kind of cool to see the continuity there. As well as the green worm, he will, if they ask, he will mention that this is a Caius worm, more famously from the undead unkillable zombie that is known as the spawn of Caius, and he'll give all this information essentially in exchange for his life. He's also completely willing to return the bones of the family members of the young boy from the tomb, so that they can all be laid to rest, and that he can hopefully be allowed to go and just live the rest of his life. With all that done, the ghost, by the way, the young boy, his name is Alistair Land, and when his bones are returned along with those of his family, he knows that he is free and he's finally at rest, and it's his last action before disappearing from this realm altogether. He does actually unlock the door to the true tomb. However, it's not quite the end of the adventure quite yet, because as the characters enter the true tomb, they are attacked by a wind warrior, by a pair of wind warriors actually. So these are guardians that are put in place in these tombs to prevent them from being looted. This is actually a pretty tough fight overall. These are fairly strong opponents. There are stronger versions of them that the characters I think come across later on, but these are really cool, sort of like final boss type of characters, and they go through the tomb itself. So the tomb for this member of the Wind Dukes, where they find several interesting items. So there are some art objects, obviously, but they also come across a an inert, so it's not currently functioning, but this talisman, this magical talisman, which they can actually have identified as being a talisman of the sphere. So an object required to control a sphere of annihilation. It's currently inactive. The magic that is in it is either gone or dormant, but it could play a role later on in the campaign. And that's essentially where this particular adventure ends. So there's, this is something that I had a lot of fun running this adventure. Talking about my experiences running it, there's only a few things that really do stick out in my memories, because this is something that I did run, like a decade ago, which is kind of scary and crazy to think of at this point, because I ran this starting in 2011, and I finished it up in 2012, and this came out way back in 2005, so almost 16 years ago. But the memories that really stick with me has to do with the very first encounter inside the Whispering Cairn itself, in which the player characters, they square off against some wolves. And I just remember that one of the players, he was playing a fighter. I think it was a female fighter, actually. He ended up changing characters later on in the campaign. I think the one that he was playing ended up dying. In fact, yes, I know he ended up dying because it was through the actions or inactions of one of the other player characters, but that's a story for another time. Hopefully I'll remember the exact details when the time comes. But I remember after fighting the wolves, he was really determined to just, skin the wolf. And so right after he skinned the wolf, he just immediately started wearing the wolf skin without doing anything to cure it or preserve it. So he's just wearing this wolf pelt that was still wet with gore from being cut off the wolf. So that was sort of a fun memory. And the encounter with the Grick actually was a lot tougher than I really expected to be, because these were, characters, I think they were second level by the time they got to the Grick. But it was a creature, a monster with damage reduction of 5/magic. It doesn't sound like a lot, but we didn't have strong spellcasters in the party. I think there was a wizard type or a sorcerer in the party, but beyond that, everyone else was using melee weapons, and they didn't have magic weapons, or they didn't have a cleric with the magic weapon spell that they could cast. So everyone was getting 5 knocked off of their damage, and it just the fight went on a little bit longer than, again, one might expect. The fight with the necromancer as well, with Filge, was also very interesting. So when he fought the player characters, he went to the point where he was knocked down to enough hit points that he was willing to surrender, and they interrogated him with all this information. And the party had struck the deal, and this is important because this will come back to haunt them later. But he made the deal, or they made the deal with Filge, that if he gave them information, released the skeletons to him, or identified which exact ones it was that needed to go back, that they would let him go. So he talked, he gave all the information that's listed here, and then I think it was the cleric, actually, as everyone else was getting ready to go, they grabbed the Caius worm and they were getting ready to leave. He literally just from behind just ran his sword through Phil's, through his back, pierced his heart, and finished him off right then and there. Now the cleric wasn't evil, or he wasn't. Sorry, I shouldn't say he wasn't lawful good or anything. I think he had a chaotic neutral alignment, because of course he had a chaotic neutral alignment. So it didn't necessarily cost him his divine abilities or anything. But this was something that, after it was done, it's just you realize that was an evil act, because you had assured him you were going to let him go, and you just took it upon yourself to execute him, even though the rest of the party hadn't, agreed to do that. So the village will come back later. It's not written into the campaign, but it was something that I added, and we'll get to that, like I said, when the time comes. But that was another memory that stuck with me really, really strongly. And then finally, like I said, the Wind Warriors, they were a tough fight because they are challenge rating 4 by themselves, and they certainly earned that. They had, they made two attacks around each, with +8 bonus, so they had a good chance of hitting. They basically never really missed the characters. And yeah, it was just a really tough fight. They also had like an area effect thing that they could do. And yeah, it was it made for a very sort of tense moment. I think a couple of the players ended up getting knocked down, were very close to the -10. And dying because you died at -10 hit points back then. So yeah, it was actually a really tough, really tough fight, but it was a rewarding one. And the thing that I really like about this adventure is that it does a lot of foreshadowing. Whereas the other, like the past campaign, the Shackled City Adventure Path, a lot of stuff was sort of secretive and hidden. Like it wasn't until the final like 4 or 5 installments, like this basically the second half of the campaign, before the characters had really a clear idea of what was going on or had really any idea what they were up against. With this one, it's much more upfront, but like I said, they do a decent job of foreshadowing things. You have the Wind Dukes going through the tomb, because they will play a role later on in the campaign. Not directly, obviously, they're all like wiped out, but their existence still plays a pretty, significant role later on in the campaign, getting the deactivated Talisman of the Sphere as, like the first major, like, item that they get. This is like, it's not, I don't think it's quite an artifact, but it's a very powerful item that, obviously the fact that they get this Talisman of the Sphere signifies that there's probably going to be a Sphere of Annihilation at some point in the campaign. So that's something, again, that sort of sets that up, and it's a long time before we get to the payoff for that. But it is cool that they actually set that up way at the very beginning, as well as hinting at the involvement of the Ebon Triad. The Ebon Triad was sort of a minor part of the Shackled City Adventure Path. Members of the group appeared in the Flood Season adventure, as well as the one where I think it was Secrets of the Soul Pillars. So they were a minor part of the Shackled City Adventure Path. They are a significant threat or a significant faction or power group that the characters have to work against in this campaign. So it was really cool seeing that they were referenced as sort of subverting the mine owner, and that they've actually taken up, residence within the mines. That there's more to the mines than necessarily what everyone in town knows about, which I believe is the setup for the next chapter of the adventure path. But just having them was really cool, because I thought that they were a very interesting group that were referenced or mentioned a couple of times in Shackled City, but really had very little to do with it beyond those couple of mentions. The Ebon Triad is basically their heretical religious organization that believes that the gods Erythnol, Vecna, and Hextor were all originally one divine being that was split into 3 different parts. His divine essence was split into 3 different parts and infused in these 3 other, they refer to them as sort of like the lesser gods that can be reformed into this one over god. So that's sort of their goal and their purpose. So it's, again, really cool to see that they are a part of this campaign. So when it comes to the opening chapters, so the Whispering Cairn versus the Life's Bazaar, which was the introduction to the Shackled City Adventure Path, this one was by far significantly better. The Life's Bazaar opening chapter, it's been a while since I did the video on it, but basically it had involved a series, like there was 2 pretty large sort of dungeon crawling aspects to that particular campaign, which was, again, for characters levels 1, like starting off first level characters, ending at 3rd. ending at third level by the time that everything's all wrapped up. But you had them going through nearly 100 rooms of like ruins that they had to sort of explore or get through. They didn't necessarily have to go through every single room, but most players that I know of really don't like leaving stuff behind them. They really don't like leaving loose ends. So my group ended up going through basically almost all 100 of those rooms. And it was really tedious feeling because while they were cool locations, like the Gnomish enclave beneath Cauldron and the dwarven stronghold beneath that. They were cool locations, but a lot of the rooms were empty and really didn't have anything interesting in them, meaning that all the time spent exploring really didn't yield much. So like I said, 100 rooms is very tedious, especially when over half of them, almost like 2/3 of the rooms, I think, had really nothing in them. The Whispering Cairn does have some dungeon crawling aspects to it, but it is a much smaller overall location. So going through the initial, the False Tomb at the beginning, like the Cairn that everyone knows, as well as going through the lair of the Architect, the lair of the Laborers, and the True Tomb was only like 26 rooms. And pretty much every single room had something, 24 rooms actually, and pretty much every room had something interesting. It had something in them that made the rooms at least worth the time to look through them. Whereas, again, you had a lot of empty space in the previous one. There's a lot to do in this adventure. Like, you're going sort of back and forth from the tomb back to the town and then back to the tomb again. But it never felt like it was being stretched out. Everything felt like it had very, clear connections, and it was very easy for the players to sort of follow the path. Like, there was really never any one point where they were like sidelined. The closest that I can say is one of the players in my group really hates any sort of color-based puzzle. So when they saw the lanterns with the different colors of the rainbow, he kind of, went into shutdown mode, like he had done when we were going through Shackled City, and they had the starry mirror with the different rooms based on the light spectrum that they had to go through. So, you kind of saw a little bit of that, but overall, this was a much better, much tighter constructed adventure. Now, with the foreshadowing, as I mentioned before, being one of the key things that I really like about it, this was, as I mentioned before, this was the second adventure path, but this was the first one that was designed with the knowledge that the adventure paths were a big hit and that it was okay to tell a much tighter, more cohesive story. So there was a lot more leeway to foreshadow. Whereas with the original adventure path, it was uncharted waters for Dungeon Magazine. So they wanted to make sure that first and foremost, each of the installments, at least for the first half of the campaign, that they were able to stand on their own and didn't necessarily feel like this major overarching story. They mixed elements in so that it was, but the adventures were really mainly designed to be able to stand alone in the event that it wasn't going to be something that the readers liked. Like if for example it didn't go over well, then they could just finish up that one adventure path. Each installment was sort of with the exception of like the last two, which technically were one that were divided into two issues because of how long it was. They could stand on their own, so they could say we tried to do like the long-term storytelling, it didn't work, but you still had 10, 11 decent modules that you could use. But with this one, they knew that the adventure paths were a huge hit. They knew that people really liked them, so it gave them the comfort to sort of, again, keep everything much tighter in terms of the overall story. So as I said, you get a lot of foreshadowing here for things that are going to happen later on, because it's just easier to, it's not easier, but they were, they had more leeway to be able to do that in this campaign, whereas before everything sort of had to be more or less not like directly connected, to the point where if the players didn't, or if the readers didn't like one issue, they wouldn't feel that like they would still like get use out of the other ones, because again, you could use them as sort of standalone. So yeah, with this one, you get the inactive Talisman of the Sphere, which is something that plays in, minor spoiler, it plays into the final chapter. Like, it doesn't really have an effect on the story until like potentially the final chapter of the campaign. But to give them that in the very opening chapter is something that I think was kind of cool. It gave them something to sort of work towards, finding a way to reactivate the magic of the talisman. So that was really cool, giving them the Caius worm that they could study or know about or see, sort of like a precursor to things that are going to come later on in the next installments. Setting up things like the Tomb of the Wind Dukes, setting up the Ebon Triad. It's just overall, like, it was a much more enjoyable opening chapter to run overall. While I love Shackled City, and there are certain aspects of the structure of Shackled City that I really did like, which I'll get into when I'm wrapping up this series, I will say that it was really nice to have something that was really, designed with the entire story in mind, and keeping that, the themes really tight all throughout. So I think that they did a really good job with that. So anyway, that was sort of my look back at the Age of Worms Chapter 1, The Whispering Cairn. So if any of you have actually gone through and run or played through the Age of Worms campaign, let me know what you thought of the opening chapter, maybe some of the experiences that you had, for example, with the thugs, with the hired goons for Balabar Smink. Did the group actually, be able to talk to them or talk their way through and get the information they needed? Or did they, just resort immediately to fisticuffs, like was basically what happened with my group? How do they deal with the necromancer Filge? And, how do they deal with the ghost of Alistair Land? Just all those things. Let me know in the comments below. So thank you guys very much for watching. I really hope you enjoyed this video. I had a lot of fun revisiting this campaign. Again, a lot of really good memories with this campaign. So I'm looking forward to getting into future installments. I'm probably only going to do one a month. I think is probably going to be a realistic target to set. As I mentioned in a previous video, I have been dealing with with just sort of a series of headaches. Some are worse than others. Like right now, I just sort of have a mild one that's just sort of like, it's annoying, but it's not debilitating. Not that any of them have been super debilitating, but it's just been difficult to work on videos while they've been going on. So hopefully that's something that will get better as time goes on. But I will say for now, I'm aiming for one of these per month. Sort of to coincide with like the release schedule. There was one installment per month. That's how I justify it to myself anyway. So anyway, thank you guys very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I will see you next time. Take care.